I never thought I'd be the kind of person who ends up at the center of a neighborhood scandal. I'm not dramatic. I don't seek conflict. I've spent most of my adult life being the person who waves politely from the driveway, who brings homemade banana bread to new neighbors, who quietly tolerates the occasional barking dog or a late-night party without saying a word. I'm a problem solver by nature, not a problem creator, and for 34 years on this earth, I have done my absolute best to move through the world without causing unnecessary friction. But there's a limit to every person's patience, and when you finally find that limit, when someone pushes you all the way to the edge of it, the response that follows has a way of being very, very thorough. Her name was Deborah Vance, and she moved into the house directly across the street from mine on a Wednesday in late September. I remember the day clearly because I was working from home, sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop and a pot of coffee, watching the moving truck through my front window the way you do when you're mildly curious and mildly bored and not yet aware that your life is about to become significantly more complicated. She was maybe 60, 65, with silver hair cut in a severe bob, and the kind of posture that suggested she had strong opinions about everything from proper lawn maintenance to the correct way to load a dishwasher. I didn't think much of it at the time. I just thought, new neighbor, and I made a mental note to bake something and introduce myself later in the week. I did introduce myself, 2 days after she moved in. I walked across the street on a Friday afternoon with a loaf of lemon poppy seed bread wrapped in parchment and tied with kitchen twine, knocked on her door, and smiled when she answered. I told her my name was Miriam, that I lived directly across from her, and that I wanted to welcome her to the neighborhood. She looked at the bread. She looked at me. She said, "I don't eat carbs," and closed the door. I stood on her porch for a moment with my lemon poppy seed bread and my outstretched hand and my wilting smile, and then I walked back across the street and ate the entire loaf myself over the course of the weekend and decided that some people simply don't want to be friends, and that was fine. What was not fine was what came next. It started small, the way these things always do. The first incident happened about 3 weeks after she moved in. I was in my front yard on a Saturday morning, planting tulip bulbs along the border of my garden bed. I had my gardening gloves on, my knees on a foam pad, a trowel in my hand, and a podcast playing through my earbuds. I was completely absorbed in what I was doing when I became aware of someone standing at the edge of my property. I pulled out one earbud and looked up. It was Deborah, standing on the sidewalk with her arms crossed, staring at me with an expression I can only describe as deeply disapproving. I said hello. She said nothing for a moment, and then she pointed at the small pile of soil I'd turned up near the edge of my lawn and said, "That dirt is going to wash into the street drain when it rains. That's illegal dumping." I blinked. I looked at the small mound of garden soil I had displaced by maybe 6 inches. I looked back at her. I said, as calmly as I could manage, that I was planting bulbs in my own garden bed and that the soil wasn't going anywhere near a drain. She said, "I'm just letting you know that I know the rules," and walked back across the street. I put my earbud back in and kept planting and told myself it was nothing. The second incident happened 11 days later. I came home from the grocery store on a Tuesday evening and parked in my own driveway, which is a thing I do every single day of my life without incident. I was unloading bags from my trunk when Deborah appeared at the edge of her property and announced that my car was blocking her sight line when she tried to pull out of her own driveway. I looked at my car. I looked at my driveway, which is a completely standard residential driveway on my side of the street, nowhere near her driveway, which is on the other side entirely. I told her, gently, that my car was parked in my driveway and that I wasn't sure how it could be blocking her view. She said, "At a certain angle it does," and I said I was sorry, but I needed to park in my own driveway, and she made a sound that I can only describe as a controlled huff and went back inside. I called my best friend Janelle that night and told her about the new neighbor. Janelle is the kind of person who can find the humor in almost anything, and she laughed and said it sounded like I'd gotten one of those neighbors, and I said yes, I believed I had, and we talked about it for 20 minutes and then moved on to other things. I still wasn't particularly worried. Difficult neighbors are a fact of life. You manage them. You document if necessary. You stay polite, and you don't give them anything to actually complain about. What I should have done was start documenting immediately. I know that now. But at the time, I thought it would blow over, the way most minor neighborhood friction eventually does when both parties settle into a routine and learn each other's patterns. I thought Deborah was just adjusting to a new place, maybe going through something difficult, maybe just a person who led with hostility until she felt comfortable. I gave her the benefit of the doubt. I kept waving from my driveway. I stopped knocking on her door. The third incident was more serious. It was a Saturday in mid-November, just starting to get cold, and I had a few friends over for dinner. Nothing loud, nothing wild. 6 women around a dining room table, good food, good wine, a playlist on low in the background, the kind of evening that ends at a reasonable hour because everyone has things to do the next day. My guests left around 11, which is not unreasonably late for a Saturday, and we said our goodbyes on the front porch because the last of us were looking up at the sky and commenting on the stars, the way you do when you've had a nice evening and you're not quite ready for it to end. We weren't shouting. We weren't playing music. We were talking at a normal conversational volume on private property at 11 o'clock on a Saturday night. A police cruiser pulled up at 11:17. I want you to understand what that felt like. I was standing on my own porch in my own neighborhood, saying goodbye to my friends, when a police officer stepped out of a patrol car and walked up my front path. My friends went quiet. I felt a flush of embarrassment so intense it was almost physical, not because I had done anything wrong, but because there is something inherently unsettling about having law enforcement arrive at your home, regardless of the reason. One of my friends, Constance, actually grabbed my arm. She's Black, like me, and I think we both had the same thought at exactly the same moment, the kind of thought that sits in your chest like a weight. The officer, his name was Patterson, according to his name tag, was professional and almost immediately apologetic in his manner. He said he'd received a noise complaint from a neighbor across the street. He said he could hear for himself that it wasn't a noise situation, but that he was required to follow up. He asked if everything was okay. I said yes. We were just finishing up a dinner party. He nodded, said to have a good evening, and went back to his car. My friends left. I stood on my porch for another moment after the cruiser pulled away, looking at Deborah's house across the street. Her front window was lit. I could see the edge of a curtain that had recently moved. I went inside. I poured myself the last of the wine, and I made a decision. The next morning, I drove to a hardware store and bought 2 security cameras, the kind that record continuously and store footage both locally and in the cloud. I installed one above my front door and one at the corner of my porch angled toward the driveway. I am not particularly handy, but I have watched enough tutorial videos to get by, and I was motivated in a way that tends to sharpen one's focus. While I was at it, I reviewed the local municipal code for my neighborhood, which I had never needed to read before but which turned out to be available online, and surprisingly comprehensive. I took notes. I paid particular attention to the noise ordinance, which specifies that prohibited noise levels begin at midnight, not 11, and to the statutes regarding false reports and harassment. I also, and I want to be clear that I did this calmly and methodically, and not out of spite, introduced myself to my immediate neighbors on both sides and to the 2 households nearest to Deborah's. I hadn't spoken to some of them in a while, and it was genuinely nice to catch up. In the course of those conversations, I mentioned casually that I had a new neighbor across the street and asked if anyone had had any interaction with her. What I learned was useful. The couple to Deborah's left, whose names were Frances and Helen, told me she had complained to them twice already, once about their garbage bins being out a few hours past pickup, and once about a wind chime on their porch. The retired man to Deborah's right, whose name was Walter, said she had knocked on his door to inform him that his fence needed to be repainted and that the peeling paint might violate HOA guidelines. He said this with a dry smile and added that we didn't have an HOA. I filed all of this away. I kept being polite. I kept waving from my driveway. The cameras were running. December came. The holidays made things quieter, or maybe Deborah was traveling because there were no incidents for a few weeks and I let myself relax slightly. I decorated my front porch the way I always do, a wreath on the door, some lights along the railing, a pair of lanterns with candles by the front steps. It's tasteful and it makes me happy, and I've been doing it every year since I bought the house. My neighbors have always said they like it. Deborah apparently did not. On the 15th of December, I received a printed note in my mailbox. Not in an envelope, just a folded piece of paper tucked under my water bill. It said, in capital letters, that my exterior Christmas lights were a fire hazard and an eyesore, and that if I didn't remove them by the end of the week, I would be reported to the city. It was not signed, but the handwriting matched a note I had seen Deborah writing at her front window one afternoon, which I knew because my camera had captured it, and because I am a paralegal and I notice details. I put the note in a folder. I labeled the folder. The lights stayed up. She called the non-emergency police line on December 19th. I know the exact date because my camera captured the timestamp on the moment the cruiser arrived. Same officer, Patterson, looking somewhat less apologetic this time and somewhat more tired. He said there had been a complaint about a fire hazard. He looked at my lights. He looked at me. He said he couldn't see anything constituting a fire hazard. I showed him the note. He looked at it. He said, "You've been keeping records?" And I said yes, I had. He said that was smart and gave me the non-emergency line number in case I wanted to file a report myself, which I thought was a very pointed piece of advice from a man who was professionally required to remain neutral. I thanked him and filed that interaction in my folder too. 3 days before Christmas, I called the non-emergency line and filed a report documenting the pattern of complaints. I was polite. I was specific. I referenced dates and times and the contents of the printed note and the 2 previous police responses. The officer who took the report was thorough and professional. He told me that if the behavior continued, there were additional steps available to me, including a formal complaint to the city about harassment via misuse of emergency services. I spent Christmas with my family upstate, came back on the 28th, and found that while I was gone, Deborah had filed a complaint with the city claiming that my holiday lights were in violation of a local code. I know this because I received a letter from the city's code enforcement office asking me to contact them to discuss the matter. I called the number on the letter the same afternoon I received it. I spoke to a very pleasant code enforcement officer named Marcus who told me the complaint had been filed and that he was required to follow up, and I told him I was happy to provide whatever documentation he needed. He asked a few questions. I answered them clearly. He asked if the lights were on a timer. I said yes. He asked if they were rated for outdoor use. I said yes, and that I could send him a photo of the packaging if needed. He was quiet for a moment and then said he didn't think that would be necessary and that the complaint would. I asked, in my most professional and even-keeled paralegal voice, whether I could ask how many complaints had been filed for my address or about my address in the past 3 months. He pulled up the records. He said, "It looks like there have been 4. He paused. "All from the same complainant." I said I see, and asked whether a pattern of unsubstantiated complaints from the same individual was something the city tracked or responded to. He said it was something the city was aware of and took seriously, and that if I wanted to provide a written statement about the pattern of behavior, there was a process for that. I said I would be in touch. I wrote the statement that evening. I attached my camera footage timestamps, the printed note, the dates of the 2 police responses, and the contact information for Francis and Helen and Walter, who had each agreed to corroborate their own experiences with Deborah in writing. I mailed it the following morning with return receipt requested, which meant I had documentation that it had been received. I emailed a copy to myself with a timestamp. I am a paralegal. I understand evidence. I understand process. And I have learned over a decade of working in law that the most powerful thing a person can do when someone is acting in bad faith is to build a meticulous, irrefutable, publicly accessible record of exactly what they have done. January was quiet. I don't know whether the city contacted Deborah, or whether someone else on the street said something, or whether she simply ran out of steam. I didn't ask. I kept the cameras running. I kept waving from my driveway. The real consequences came in February, and they came from a direction I hadn't entirely anticipated. There is a neighborhood association in our area, not the HOA that Walter had referenced, which doesn't exist, but a voluntary civic group that meets monthly to discuss local issues, coordinates the annual block party, and maintains a neighborhood newsletter that about half the residents actually read. I am a member. I have been a member since I moved in. I went to the February meeting, which was held at Francis and Helen's house, as it is every other month, and which Deborah had apparently discovered and decided to attend for the first time. She arrived about 10 minutes after the meeting started, introduced herself as the new resident at her address, and immediately began raising concerns. She talked about noise, about lighting, about what she described as lax standards in the neighborhood. She was pointed. She was not subtle. A few people glanced at me. I kept my expression neutral and my hands folded in my lap. When she finished, the woman who runs the meetings, a retired schoolteacher named Gloria, asked if anyone else had comments. I raised my hand. Gloria called on me. I said, in my calmest and most measured voice, that I wanted to address a few of the concerns that had been raised and to share some context that the group might find useful. And then I walked through it. Not dramatically, not emotionally, just clearly, factually, in chronological order. The noise complaint at 11 on a Saturday. The fire hazard complaint about rated exterior lights. The code enforcement investigation that had been closed as unsubstantiated. The printed note. The pattern of complaints, for in 3 months, all from the same address. I did not editorialize. I did not call her names. I let the facts do what facts, when properly assembled, always do. The room was quiet by the time I finished. Deborah was staring at me with an expression that had shifted from confidence to something more complicated. Gloria said, carefully, that the neighborhood association took seriously any misuse of city resources, including repeated, unsubstantiated complaints. She said she hoped all neighbors could work toward respectful communication. She said it in a way that made clear exactly who she was speaking to. After the meeting, 3 neighbors I had never spoken to before came up to introduce themselves and thank me for speaking up. 2 of them had their own stories about interactions with Deborah in her first few months on the street. One of them had also received a printed note. They hadn't known what to do with it. I told them to keep it and to document everything going forward. Frances pulled me aside on the way out and said, quietly, that Deborah had apparently been asked to leave her previous neighborhood association under similar circumstances in another part of the city. He said had heard it from someone who knew someone, and while I couldn't verify it, I filed it away with everything else. Spring arrived slowly, the way it does in this part of the country, with weeks of gray before the warmth finally commits. My tulip bulbs came up in April, the ones I had planted the morning Deborah first appeared at the edge of my property to tell me about imaginary violations. They were a deep orange, almost red, and they lined the border of my garden bed in a way that made me unreasonably happy every time I came home. I had not removed my porch cameras, and I did not plan to. But the footage I was collecting had become significantly less interesting. Deborah went in and out of her house. She got her mail. She put her bins out on the right day, which I noticed and thought was probably not a coincidence. She did not knock on my door. She did not wave. I don't know exactly what shifted for her, whether it was the code enforcement dead end, or the neighborhood meeting, or simply the dawning awareness that she had miscalculated who she had decided to target. I'm a quiet person who plants tulips and bakes lemon bread and has dinner parties that end at a reasonable hour. But I am also a paralegal with 10 years of experience building legal records, a folder full of documentation, 2 cloud sync security cameras, 3 corroborating witnesses, and a deep and abiding understanding of exactly how far a pattern of behavior can take a complaint when it's pointed in the right direction. I have thought, in my more reflective moments, about what Deborah must have imagined when she first looked across the street and decided I was a problem to be managed. Maybe she thought I would be embarrassed by the police showing up. Maybe she thought I would apologize, take down my lights, apologize again, make myself smaller. Maybe she was used to people doing that, to absorbing her complaints and adjusting themselves to her preferences and never pushing back. I genuinely don't know. But I think about the version of this story where I did that, where I let the first incident go, and the second and the third, where I let embarrassment do what she wanted it to do, and I feel a quiet, steady gratitude that I am not that version of myself. Because here is what I have learned, both from working in law and from living as a woman in a world that has a long tradition of expecting women to accommodate discomfort until it becomes unmanageable. Documentation is power. A record is a record. Facts, assembled carefully and delivered calmly, are not something you can argue with. You can be louder than a fact, but you cannot be louder than a folder full of time-stamped evidence, a statement filed with a city office, 3 neighbors willing to put their names on paper, and an association meeting where you ran out of room to spin the narrative. The summer was quiet. The block party in July was genuinely lovely. Deborah did not attend, which I noticed, and which I suspected was related to a conversation she may have had with Gloria at some point that I was not privy to. I brought a pasta salad and a pitcher of iced tea and spent 3 hours in the backyard of the family at the end of the street, talking and laughing and watching the kids chase each other through the sprinklers, and at no point did anyone knock on my door to tell me that my presence was a code violation. Walter stopped me on the sidewalk in August and told me, with some satisfaction, that Deborah had started speaking to him again after months of silence, not warmly, but at least civilly. He said she had mentioned to him that she was thinking about taking a trip to visit family on the West Coast for an extended period. He said he thought that was probably a good development for everyone. I agreed that it probably was. My cameras are still up. The footage is still backing up to the cloud every night. Not because I'm waiting for something to happen, but because I am someone who has learned not to mistake a quiet period for a permanent peace. I am careful. I am thorough. I plant my bulbs, and I bake my bread, and I have my friends over for dinner, and I say goodnight at a reasonable hour. I wave from my driveway. And if anyone across the street ever decides again that I am the kind of person who can be pushed around with a printed note and a non-emergency police call, they're going to find out, the way Deborah found out, that the quietest person on the block sometimes has the most comprehensive paper trail. The tulips are already planned for next fall. Deeper red this time. I think they're going to be beautiful,